There are moments when a single sentence lands so sharply that your mind needs a moment to catch up. Mine arrived on a warm afternoon in Nashville when everything I thought I could tolerate shifted at once. My name is Mallory, and until that day, I truly believed I already knew the limits of how far my family could push me. "Sorry, your iPhone 17 is broken," my older sister said, after I refused to lend her $10,000. Her voice was flat, almost bored, and the shattered screen in her hand made it obvious she had not dropped it by mistake. I asked why she had even touched my phone without asking. She gave a small shrug as if this was something I should not take personally, as if the damage she caused was a minor hiccup I should clean up quietly. Before I could process anything fully, Mom stepped in with that familiar softness she used only in one direction and told me it was just an accident. She added that I should not make a big deal out of it. She did not ask what happened or look closely enough to see the way my jaw tightened. It was the same script as always. My sister created the mess, Mom swept it aside, and I was expected to swallow the frustration as some sort of proof that I cared about family. I stayed silent because silence has a way of revealing what people expect from you. My sister watched me the way someone watches a machine they believe will perform exactly the way it always has. She truly thought I would absorb the hit and move on. Instead, I felt something settle inside me with a clarity I had not felt before. I knew I had reached a point I could not return from. If you were in my place with the phone in pieces and the excuses already waiting to be used, what would you have done next? Tell me your thoughts and how you would handle a moment like this. That afternoon, when I returned to my apartment in Nashville, the quiet felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were watching me sort through everything that had happened. I set my bag down and tried to focus on my breathing, yet my mind kept circling back to the same truth I had avoided naming for years. My older sister, Kendra Collins, had not suddenly turned into someone capable of smashing my phone for $10,000. She had always walked the line between entitlement and convenience, and I had spent most of my life stepping aside to make space for her choices. I sank onto my couch and replayed moments I had forced myself to minimize, the ones that piled up quietly enough to pass for normal at the time. There were the afternoons when she borrowed money, promising to return it before the month ended, only for me to cover her shortfalls when she forgot a payment. There were the mornings when I discovered she had used my name to apply for a store card because hers had too many late fees. Each incident seemed small on its own, yet the cost always fell on my shoulders, while Mom insisted I should be patient because families look out for one another. That version of looking out had always tilted toward Kendra, no matter how inconvenient it was for me. As the tension pressed deeper, my best friend Jordan Hale called, after noticing the way my voice cracked when we spoke earlier. Jordan had known me long enough to catch the shift I tried to hide, and when I explained what happened, the frustration that colored Jordan's silence told me everything. I rarely vented yet. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt the years of imbalance settle into place with a clarity that startled me. Jordan reminded me that my reactions were not dramatic, but overdue, and hearing someone validate that truth gave me just enough steadiness to keep unpacking the memories I had stored away. It was impossible to ignore how early the dynamic had begun. When I was still in school, Mom always found a reason to soften consequences for Kendra claiming she was sensitive or overwhelmed, while I was expected to adjust because I could supposedly handle more. The message was subtle, but consistent, and with time I learned how to absorb disappointment without letting it show. I thought restraint made me the responsible one, the daughter who kept the peace, yet all it did was teach everyone that I would bend until there was nothing left to bend. Sitting there, I realized I had reached a place where even small acts of dismissal carried weight I could no longer absorb. The shattered phone was only the most visible part of a pattern that had stretched across my entire life, and once I named it, I could no longer pretend it was something harmless. A tiredness I had not allowed myself to acknowledge settled through me, heavier than I wanted to admit, yet unmistakably honest. I knew I could not return to the version of myself who tolerated everything out of duty. Something had shifted in me steady and irreversible, and for the first time in years I understood that pulling back was not disloyalty, but survival. That night, when I checked my accounts again, a sense of unease settled over me with a clarity I could no longer ignore. I opened my laptop with the intention of reviewing only a few recent transactions. Yet the moment the dashboard loaded, I realized the situation stretched far deeper than a single broken phone. What began as a simple search for unusual charges quickly unfolded into a trail of activity that looked nothing like my own behavior, and the more I scrolled, the more the pieces began aligning in ways that tightened my chest. The first red flag appeared on my Apple Family sharing page. I had set it up years ago for convenience, mostly so my devices stayed synced and my subscriptions stayed organized. However, when I opened the purchase history, several apps I had never downloaded appeared in the list, bundled into months of quiet charges that slipped past my attention. They were lifestyle subscriptions, editing tools, and premium upgrades that matched someone else's habits rather than mine. The pattern felt unmistakable, especially when I recognized the timestamps lining up with moments when Kendra had borrowed my phone under the pretense of checking her messages. At the time, the requests had felt harmless, yet the evidence displayed something far more deliberate. As I dug deeper, I noticed several microtransactions routed through Apple Pay. Some were small grocery charges, others were miscellaneous household items from stores Mom frequented. The amounts were minor on their own, low enough to blend into any monthly budget without raising alarms, yet the consistency of the pattern made the intention difficult to dismiss. I remembered the times Mom mentioned forgetting her card or needing to pay quickly, moments I had brushed off as routine family favors. Seeing the trail logged in my own records stripped away the excuses I had held on to. Trying to keep my focus steady, I called Jordan and asked for help, verifying whether certain charges showed signs of being manually approved or automatically recurring. Jordan approached the situation from a technical angle rather than an emotional one, examining the timestamps, the device IDs, and the authorization logs. Without the softness of sympathy, Jordan pointed out that several purchases had been authorized through devices that were not registered to me, which meant someone had been using my credentials without my knowledge. The precision of that conclusion pushed everything into a sharper shape, leaving me with an unsettling recognition of how long this boundary had been crossed. I opened a blank document and began compiling each suspicious entry, organizing them by category so my thoughts would not scatter. The list grew steadily, turning from scattered lines into a structured record of how my accounts had been treated as communal property. I highlighted the apps tied to Kendra's habits and marked the purchases aligning with Mom's routines, then grouped the remaining anomalies under a column I labeled Uncertain Source. As the file expanded, it became clear that the financial damage reached farther than the visible totals. What troubled me most was the realization that this misuse was not new, yet I had been too willing to rationalize the signs until now. Once the evidence sat plainly in front of me, I felt a quiet shift inside a shift that made denial impossible. I opened my settings and began the first round of what I silently called my quiet moves. Subtle actions meant to protect myself without announcing anything. I updated my passwords with combinations no one could guess, removed all shared devices, and revoked permissions tied to old logins. Each step felt like reclaiming a part of my life I had handed over too easily. By the time I finished, the document glowed on my screen, filled with proof of choices I had allowed others to make for me. The exhaustion that followed did not overwhelm me this time. It steadied me, reminding me that recognition was the first step toward taking back control, and the trail of evidence I gathered made one thing certain: the pattern had finally reached its end. Near midnight, I began moving with a clarity that felt unfamiliar, yet steady, as if every scattered thought had finally aligned after the discoveries I made earlier that evening. The apartment around me rested in a muted calm that helped me focus on what needed to be done. I opened the Apple ID control panel and took a slow breath before undoing the family sharing network entirely. Each device that was not mine appeared like a reminder of the boundaries I had allowed to stretch far beyond reason. As I removed every layer of access, I could feel a quiet separation taking shape, not through dramatic declarations, but through the small, deliberate clicks of someone reclaiming what belonged to her. I continued by updating every password linked to my digital life. I changed the main Apple ID first, then moved through secondary email logins, banking access points, encrypted notes, and archived storage. I created long sequences of characters with no personal meaning, so nothing could be guessed or retraced. Each confirmation screen felt like a door closing behind me, and the sense of control that returned with every step settled into my chest with a calm resolve. I checked for any remaining logged-in devices, revoked them without hesitation, and watched the list shrink until only my own devices remained. The moment the page refreshed, a new kind of stillness settled into the room. Next, I called the carrier. I verified my identity, confirmed the account number, and requested the immediate termination of Kendra's secondary line. The representative asked if I understood that this action would fully disconnect the service she had been using. My answer was steady, firm, and final. When the representative confirmed that the line had been removed from my account, I noted the call ID and the exact timestamp in my growing document. Having a clear piece of evidence for each action gave me a sense of grounding, as if I were stepping onto solid ground after standing on something unstable for far too long. Once the confirmation arrived, I drafted a notification to the accounts Kendra had accessed through my Apple ID. I did not include blame or emotional explanations. I simply stated that all permissions were revoked, that linked services would no longer function, and that I would not be responsible for any charges that appeared from that moment forward. I sent the message without expecting a reply, because I understood that my goal was not to engage in another draining conversation, but to close the pathways that should never have existed. After that, I contacted Kendra's landlord, the same person who once required me to co-sign her lease when she was facing financial issues. I reintroduced myself and asked about the current status of her contract. The landlord mentioned a few outstanding charges, so I requested copies of the relevant documents. I explained that I intended to withdraw my guarantee within the time frame allowed by the agreement and asked for written confirmation once the process was complete. The conversation remained brief because the landlord recognized that my request fell entirely within my rights. When the documents arrived in my inbox, I saved every file to a dedicated folder and backed them up again in my private cloud storage. I returned to my master document and added each completed step. With every new line, the situation that once felt tangled and overwhelming became structured enough for me to see exactly where I stood. I closed my laptop just as the clock marked the start of a new day, and the quiet surrounding me settled with a different weight than before. As I looked at the faint reflection of my face on the dark screen, I understood that the silent choices I made tonight were not only meant to sever old patterns, but also to ensure that I would never slip back into a life where my boundaries could be treated as optional. The next morning, when I arrived at the office, I already sensed that the day would demand a level of steadiness I had only recently learned to trust in myself. I set my bag on my desk, reviewed my calendar for a brief moment, and then heard the hurried steps of the front desk assistant heading straight toward me. She informed me in a low voice that 2 visitors were waiting in the lobby demanding to speak with me. Even before I reached the hallway, I knew exactly who they were. Kendra stood in the center of the reception area with a posture meant to claim attention she believed she deserved. Her expression carried a mix of fury and entitlement that she was not trying to hide. Mom stood slightly behind her, attempting to mask discomfort with a soft tone that did not match the impatience visible in her eyes. The moment Kendra spotted me, she pushed forward with no intention of restraint. "You locked me out of everything. Fix it right now," she said loudly enough for several employees to turn their heads. Mom followed with a gentle plea. "Mallory, please stop being unreasonable. Your sister is stressed. Restore her access. Her voice tried to sound composed, yet it still carried an expectation that I would eventually give in the same way I used to. I kept my stance firm. I reminded them that every account in question belonged solely to me, and that I had acted within my full rights. Kendra refused to accept what she called an excuse. She leaned closer with a glare that revealed the pressure she felt. If you refuse, I will make sure everyone here knows exactly how selfish you are. Do you think they will respect you after that? Jordan entered the area at that moment in a professional capacity, as part of our company's internal compliance team. Jordan did not approach me for emotional support. Instead, Jordan positioned himself nearby to ensure that no one violated conduct policies. There was no comforting, no softening of the situation, and no involvement in the dispute unfolding between me and my family. Kendra escalated quickly when she saw that I remained calm. You owe me access. I built everything through your accounts. You cannot shut me out because you are upset. I kept eye contact and replied with deliberate clarity that unauthorized use of another person's Apple ID in financial services was unacceptable. I stated that the removal of her access was a necessary corrective action and not an impulsive reaction to hurt feelings. Mom attempted once more to use the familiar appeal to familial obligation, but the weight of that argument no longer reached me. The commotion drew the attention of office management, who arrived with a firm request. They informed Kendra that she was disrupting a secure workspace and had to leave immediately. She pushed back with a confrontational tone, insisting she had every right to stay. When security approached, she finally stepped toward the exit. Before crossing the doorway, she turned sharply and delivered a final threat. You will regret this when you need us. I answered with a steady voice that surprised even me. I told her that every decision I made reflected what had already happened, and that I was prepared to accept whatever followed. Once they left the building, I paused briefly to gather my breath, fully aware that this confrontation marked only the beginning of the shift I had committed myself to see through. 3 days later, I sensed the first real shift in the atmosphere around me, a shift that showed how far the ripple effects of my quiet decisions had begun to reach. I woke with a strange steadiness that morning, a clarity that felt earned rather than borrowed, and I prepared myself for whatever would unfold across the next hours. What I did not expect was how quickly the walls around Kendra would start closing in once the systems propping her up finally stopped carrying her weight. The first sign arrived through a brief message from a colleague who wondered whether I had heard about the email outage in Kendra's department. I kept my response neutral since her employer's internal problems had nothing to do with me. My focus remained on my own work until mid-morning, when an unfamiliar number called my office line. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a supervisor from Kendra's workplace and asked whether I had any insight into why she could not access her corporate account. His tone suggested he believed I might hold a missing piece of information. I clarified that I had no involvement in the administration of their digital platforms and that any authentication issues would need to be addressed directly with their internal team. He thanked me politely, although I sensed he realized there was far more happening than he had initially assumed. By early afternoon, another consequence emerged. My landlord forwarded a notice from the property manager of Kendra's apartment complex. They requested confirmation regarding the financial guarantee I had provided when she first moved in. I opened the document carefully and drafted a formal statement retracting my support. I included every required detail with careful precision, then submitted it through the official portal so there would be a complete record of the change. Once I received the confirmation, I saved the file in the same folder that held the rest of the documentation I had been compiling. Later that day, my phone lit up again, this time with a message from a cousin who asked why Mom was calling relatives to express her concern about what she described as my completely unreasonable behavior. According to her, I had left Kendra helpless during a challenging moment and brought embarrassment to the family. I allowed the message to sit on my screen for several minutes before answering because I needed to consider what outcome I wanted from the conversation. I finally wrote that personal boundaries were not acts of hostility and that none of the current complications had been created by me. I did not offer further explanation because I had reached a point in my life where unnecessary justification felt like a surrender of control. While the relatives debated and speculated, Kendra faced a stronger wave of problems. She attempted to present alternative documents to her employer, but everything required access to the email address she could no longer open. Human Resources temporarily suspended her while they investigated what they called irregular credential activity. I heard about this only because Jordan forwarded a short update from someone who had witnessed the meeting. Jordan did not comment on the situation and did not express sympathy on my behalf. He merely passed the information in the same direct manner he used whenever we discussed factual details related to my case. That evening, I sat at my desk and reviewed the timeline of events from the past several days. Each action I had taken had been quiet, deliberate, and fully within my rights. The consequences unfolding now were not punishments I had imposed, but outcomes Kendra had created for herself. Watching those patterns finally surface brought an unexpected sense of closure. I understood that this was only the beginning, yet I also recognized that my boundaries were finally holding. For the first time in years, I felt no need to rescue anyone from the fallout of their own choices. A week later, I realized that the silence surrounding Kendra had taken on a heavier quality, as if the consequences that had been building around her finally decided to arrive all at once. I noticed the shift first through a brief message forwarded by a colleague who had attended a meeting with her company's HR department. He wrote that her suspension was no longer temporary because she failed to complete mandatory verification steps that required access to systems she could not enter. I read the message twice without reacting. I felt a distant sense of recognition, as though I had expected this moment to unfold in its exact shape. Later that morning, another notification appeared on my phone. It came from the company's employment portal, the one where I had once signed an income verification document to support her application during a period when she insisted she needed help, just until she settled in. The alert showed that her employer had filed a termination notice that would soon be reflected on future screenings. It was clinical in tone, stripped of emotion, which made it even more striking. I sat with it quietly, aware that this was one of the final threads she had relied on as proof of independence. By midweek, the second consequence emerged. The property manager of her apartment complex emailed me with a follow-up message requesting an updated guarantor form. They wrote that without renewed confirmation, the lease would automatically enter a 30-day reconsideration period. I opened their message, reviewed the details they attached, and submitted documents confirming my withdrawal. Within a few hours, they acknowledged it and added a formal notice explaining that Kendra would need to meet income requirements on her own. I saved the correspondence in the same folder where I kept the other records because organization brought me a certain steadiness during these days. That evening, a relative from out of town sent me a concerned message. She said that Mom had been calling various branches of the family, explaining that I had abandoned Kendra during a moment of crisis, and that everything happening to her was the result of my refusal to act like a sister. I read the message slowly. I could almost hear Mom's familiar mix of guilt and contradiction. If her statements had been consistent, perhaps they would have carried weight, but she shifted her narrative depending on audience and outcome, and this pattern had repeated throughout my life. I wrote back that each adult must take responsibility for the structures they depend on. I kept my answer brief because further explanation rarely changed anything. 2 days later, I received confirmation that Kendra had been given a deadline to vacate the apartment. Word traveled quickly through relatives that she packed in a rush and moved into a spare room belonging to a distant cousin who lived nearly an hour from the city center. Apparently, she tried to present alternative proof of finances but could not meet the thresholds. They said she appeared shocked by how fast everything unraveled, as if she still believed someone would intervene on her behalf. When I finished reading those updates, I placed my phone face down and returned to the task in front of me. I had signed paperwork for my own move earlier that morning. The new apartment was tucked far from downtown Nashville in a quieter neighborhood that felt like a different rhythm entirely. The drive was longer, yet something about the distance felt right. I wanted a space where no one barged through boundaries or used my stability as a safety net. On the following afternoon, a letter from Mom appeared in my mailbox. Her handwriting was uneven. She alternated between blaming me, defending Kendra, and contradicting her own arguments in consecutive lines. I read it once without letting any of it settle, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. I did not owe her a response, and I no longer felt the urge to carry responsibility that did not belong to me. As my moving boxes stacked higher, I sensed the shape of my life shifting into something steadier. The chaos circling the family no longer reached me. They operated in their turbulence, and I stood outside of it for the first time. It felt less like a victory, and more like a return to myself, a quiet acknowledgement that peace sometimes begins the moment you stop allowing others to define your role in their storms. 1 month later, the rhythm of my life settled into a steadier pattern that felt earned rather than borrowed. My workdays became more focused because I no longer spent energy anticipating the next crisis that might erupt around Kendra. My productivity increased in ways that surprised even my supervisor, and the additional responsibilities I accepted came with a pay raise that quietly affirmed my decision to protect my boundaries. I moved through the weeks with a clarity that had been missing for years, and each completed project reinforced the feeling that I had reclaimed control of my direction. News about Kendra arrived in fragments, usually through relatives who struggled to understand how she had fallen so quickly from the comfortable position she once held. They said she bounced between temporary jobs that paid inconsistently, and none of them provided the stability she needed to regain footing. Without a guarantor and without reliable income records, she found herself unable to sign new leases. She remained in that distant cousin's home where patience was wearing thin. Her expenses grew heavier while her earnings shrank, and those who once stepped forward to rescue her now avoided involvement altogether. I listened when these updates reached me, though I did not seek them out. During that same period, Mom attempted to call several times, leaving messages that alternated between emotional appeals and attempts to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. I allowed the calls to pass without response, because each message revealed the same contradiction. She wanted me to undo the consequences that Kendra created while refusing to acknowledge the history that led to this distance. My silence was not punishment, it was self-preservation. In the middle of all this, Jordan stopped by one afternoon after finishing a security rotation near my neighborhood. We sat on my balcony with iced tea while discussing neutral topics like traffic patterns and office renovations. He did not bring up the family situation, and I did not offer details. The conversation felt light and respectful, free of the unspoken pressure that had existed when he witnessed the confrontation at work. When he left, I appreciated that the visit was simply a gesture of familiarity rather than a rescue attempt. As the month closed, I recognized that my life felt simpler because I had finally stepped outside the roles others assigned to me. I no longer served as a buffer for their decisions or a catch-all solution for their emergencies. Peace became possible when responsibility returned to its rightful owners. I learned that boundaries are not declarations of anger, but commitments to self-respect. When people grow accustomed to leaning on you without accountability, they mistake your silence for agreement and your support for obligation. Stepping back revealed which relationships relied on genuine care and which depended on convenience. The moment I stopped absorbing the weight of other people's choices, I finally understood that protecting my well-being does not require permission from those who once benefited from my compliance. Thank you for following this story through each turning point and for giving space to a perspective shaped by difficult choices. If you have ever stepped away from a situation that demanded more than it returned, I would love to hear how you navigated that change. Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments so others who face similar crossroads can feel less alone on their path.